in an Italian hill town called Altavilla, just a few miles inland from the invasion beaches at Salerno. A 22-year-old American private stood at the upper window of a stone ammunition storehouse and watched the Germans come to take the town back. His name was Charles Kelly, and he was, at that moment, close to the last American left in that building. His unit had been ordered to pull out, and someone had to hold the storehouse, this one building, packed with ammunition, long enough for the rest of them to withdraw alive. If it fell too soon, they died in the open. So Charles Kelly, a private, volunteered to stay behind and hold it by himself. What he did over the next stretch of that fight made him the most famous enlisted soldier in America. From the German side, taking that storehouse should have been simple. They had the numbers, they had the momentum. They had already pushed the Americans out of Altavilla once, and were closing in to finish the job. And inside that building, as far as tactics were concerned, there was one man. But that one man had, quite literally, an armory at his back. Charles Kelly was standing inside a storehouse full of weapons and ammunition, and he set about using all of it. As the Germans advanced on the building, a storm of fire came out of that upper window. And it did not stop, and it did not seem to come from just one rifle, and the attack stalled. What he was firing was everything he could get his hands on. Kelly moved through that storehouse grabbing weapons and emptying them into the attackers. A Browning automatic rifle, the heavy, fast-firing BR, and then other rifles as the BR ran dry, and grenades, and by some accounts a bazooka, the shoulder-fired rocket launcher, which he turned on the Germans at close range. He fired one weapon until it was empty or too hot, set it down, and picked up the next, working his way through the arsenal around him, a one-man firing line in a single window. For a while it worked. The Germans could not rush a building that was pouring out that much fire, but ammunition, even a storehouse full of it, does not last forever, and eventually Charles Kelly reached the bottom of it. The guns ran out. He had fired the automatic rifles dry, thrown the grenades, spent what he could spend, and the Germans were still coming, closer now, and the men he was covering were not yet clear. Most soldiers at that point are finished. There is nothing left to fight with. But Charles Kelly was standing in an ammunition storehouse. And an ammunition storehouse contains one thing in abundance even when the guns are empty. It contains bombs. It contains mortar shells. And Charles Kelly looked at the crates of 60mm mortar rounds stacked around him, shells designed to be dropped down a tube and fired, and he had an idea that should not have worked. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. He turned the mortar shells into hand grenades. A 60mm mortar shell is not built to be thrown. It is built to be dropped down a mortar tube, which arms it and launches it. But Kelly worked out how to arm one by hand, pulling the safety pin, and then he simply threw it out the window at the Germans below, and it went off. And then he did it again and again. One after another, Charles Kelly armed mortar shells and hurled them out of that upper window by hand, raining them down on the attackers, an improvised bombardment thrown from a man's own arm. It is one of the most extraordinary improvisations of the entire war, a soldier, out of every proper weapon, picking up the shells around him and throwing them like stones that exploded. It held, the mortar shells coming down by hand, on top of everything else that had poured out of that window were enough. The German attack could not close the final distance, and behind Kelly, his comrades used the time he was buying them to get clear of Altavilla. He held that storehouse until the withdrawal was complete and the men he was covering were safe, and only then did he get out himself. He had, essentially alone, held off a German assault on a fortified town long enough to save an entire withdrawing force, using a Browning rifle, a bazooka, grenades, and finally mortar shells thrown by hand. The men who walked out of Altavilla alive that day owed it, in large part, to one private in one window who would not leave until they were gone. And here is the detail that turned Charles Kelly from a hero into a legend, the story the other soldiers told for years afterward, almost unable to believe it. In the middle of all this, the assault, the emptying weapons, the mortar shells, Kelly is said to have paused, gone down into the kitchen of the house, cracked several eggs raw into an empty ration can, and swallowed them, taken a drink from a bottle of wine he found, remarked that it tasted like soda pop, and then gone back to the window to shoot a German sniper out of a tree before returning to his meal. Some of that has surely grown in the retelling, and we can't verify every flourishish, but it captures something true about the man that the official record confirms. An almost impossible, matter-of-fact calm in the middle of a firefight that would have broken most people. But the storehouse was only the finale. To hold that building was extraordinary, but Charles Kelly had already spent that same day and the day before volunteering for one suicidal job after another, all across the fighting for Altavilla, and to understand why a single private ended up alone in that window with mortar shells in his hands, you have to back up a few hours to the string of one-man missions that had already, by the time he reached the storehouse, started to make the other soldiers look at him as though he was something not quite natural. That is where the name came from. That is where Commando Kelly was born. Roll the clock back. The men of Kelly's division had fought their way inland from the Salerno beaches into the hills, and the fighting around Altavilla was vicious. The Germans held the high ground, and every advance ran into machine guns, mortars, and snipers dug into the slopes. And in the middle of that, Private Charles Kelly began raising his hand for the jobs no sane man wanted. First, he volunteered for a patrol to find and destroy the German machine gun nests that had the battalion pinned down. He went forward with a small group, and, firing his bayar, he helped wipe the gun positions out, closing with the enemy gunners directly and killing them where they lay behind their weapons. Then he volunteered again for something even worse. The battalion needed to know whether the enemy held a particular hill, Hill 315, and needed contact established across roughly a mile of open, fire-swept ground. Kelly said he would go, and he crawled and ran and fought his way across that ground. Some accounts put the distance he covered under fire that day at close to 2 miles, through sniper fire and mortar fire and artillery, alone, to scout the enemy positions and get the information back. He made it, and he returned with the truth the commanders needed, that the Germans held Hill 315 in strength, in organized positions. He had crossed a killing ground twice, on his own, to carry a message. And he still was not done. What came next was ammunition. The forward troops were running low, and the resupply had to come up by hand under fire. So Charles Kelly organized and led a human chain of soldiers, a line of men, by one account nearly 3/4 of a mile long, passing ammunition forward from hand to hand up toward the front through the enemy's fire to keep the fight supplied. Then, and only then, having already scouted under fire twice and destroyed machine gun nests and run an ammunition line, did he take the post that would make him famous, the order to help hold that ammunition storehouse by the town square as the Germans counterattacked. By the time he reached that window, Charles Kelly had already done a week's worth of impossible things in a single day. And that is how Commando Kelly was born. The soldiers who watched one private do all of that in the space of a day and a night gave him the name, half in awe and half in disbelief, and it stuck to him for the rest of his life. But to really understand what happened at Altavilla, why these men were fighting and dying for Italian hill towns in September 1943, and who this Pittsburgh private even was, we need to pull back from the fight and look at the invasion that put him there. One of the most desperate Allied landings of the entire war, the day the Americans first set foot on the mainland of Europe, and very nearly got thrown back into the sea. Before we pull back to the invasion, follow what happened to Charles Kelly next, because the arc from here is steep, and it goes both up and, later, painfully down. If this is the kind of history you want kept alive, subscribe. Forgotten heroes like this one survive only if we keep saying their names. What Kelly did at Altavilla did not stay a secret among his squad. War correspondents got hold of the story of the private who had held a town with mortar shells thrown by hand, and it went off like a rocket. Newspapers across Europe and the United States ran it. Commando Kelly became a household name almost overnight, the reckless, grinning one-man army from Pittsburgh who had done the impossible. The army made it official. For his actions at Altavilla, Charles Kelly was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor, and in doing so, he became the first enlisted man in the entire European theater of the war to receive it. The medal was presented in early 1944. Accounts differ a little on the exact date and setting, but the citation is clear enough about what it was for. The patrol against the machine guns, the reconnaissance under fire, and above all the defense of the ammunition storehouse, where, out of ammunition for his weapons, he used mortar shells as grenades to hold the enemy and cover his unit's withdrawal. The first Medal of Honor of the European War had gone to a private who fought with whatever was in reach. Then America did to Charles Kelly what it did to its heroes. It brought him home and put him on display. He was sent back to the United States on a war bond and goodwill tour, and his hometown of Pittsburgh gave him a hero's welcome. Huge crowds turned out to see the local boy who had become a national legend And he was handed the key to the city and courted by Hollywood and by writers and by companies who all wanted a piece of Commando Kelly. He was 23 years old, and in the middle of all that adulation, Kelly said something that turned out to be one of the most quietly prophetic things any hero of that war ever said. "These medals," he told someone, "will just be a lot of brass after the war, and I'll just be another ex-soldier." He was right, and we will come to how right he was. But hold that thought. The grinning young hero at the top of the world, quietly certain it would not last. And let us finally pull the lens all the way back. Because to understand Charles Kelly, and to understand why he and thousands of other young Americans were fighting through the hills above Salerno, in the first place, we have to go back to who he was before the war, to the untested division he served in, and to the enormous, desperate gamble on an Italian beach that dropped him into the fight of his life. This is the context that the Storehouse sits inside. Charles E. Kelly was born in 1920 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, one of a large working-class family, and by his own cheerful admission he was no model soldier. He had, as he put it, a fondness for guns, but he had trouble with the spit-and-polish side of army life. He even, by some accounts, washed out of paratrooper training before he ever got to combat. Nothing about the young Charles Kelly marked him as a future Medal of Honor recipient. He was assigned as an infantryman to the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, a former National Guard outfit, and in the late summer of 1943 that division was handed one of the most dangerous jobs of the war so far, to lead the invasion of the Italian mainland. The invasion was codenamed Operation Avalanche, and its target was the Bay of Salerno on Italy's western coast south of Naples. On the 9th of September 1943, the 36th Division stormed ashore there, and in doing so, these men became part of the first Allied invasion of the European mainland, the opening of the long, brutal road up through Italy. The Germans were ready for them. Far from a walkover, Salerno turned into a knife-edge battle. German forces counterattacked the beachhead ferociously in the days that followed, driving toward the sea, and at some moments the whole invasion hung in the balance, close to being thrown back into the water. The men of the 36th, most of them in combat for the very first time, were fighting for survival almost from the moment they landed. It was in that desperate fight to hold and expand the Salerno Beachhead that the division pushed inland into the hills, toward towns like Altavilla that commanded the high ground. And it was there, in his very first days of combat, that the unpromising private from Pittsburgh, with a fondness for guns, suddenly became something else entirely. The same Charles Kelly who couldn't handle parade ground discipline turned out to be almost supernaturally steady under fire, the man who volunteered for every terrible job and came back from all of them. War does that sometimes. It finds the person nobody expected and hands them a moment. Salerno handed Charles Kelly his, and he met it with mortar shells thrown by hand from a storehouse window. So hold the whole picture now. A raw National Guard division, most of them fighting for the first time, thrown onto a beach that nearly became a catastrophe. A war that was only just beginning its long climb up the Italian peninsula, and in the middle of it, a 22-year-old who had washed out of paratrooper school, turning into the first Medal of Honor, enlisted man of the European War. Knowing the desperation of Salerno, the Storehouse stand makes a deeper kind of sense. It was not showing off. It was a man doing whatever it took in a battle where everything was on the line, and knowing how the war lifted Charles Kelly so high makes what happened to him afterward all the harder to hear. Remember what Charles Kelly said at the height of his fame, that the medals would just be a lot of brass after the war, and he'd just be another ex-soldier. He was almost exactly right. When the war ended and the parade stopped and the country moved on, the fame that had lifted Commando Kelly evaporated and the hard part of his life began. His attempts at business struggled and failed. Money was a constant, grinding problem. He suffered real personal loss and hardship in the years that followed. The most famous enlisted soldier in America slid, decade by decade, into obscurity and difficulty, a forgotten man in a country that had once handed him the keys to its cities. The brass, just as he'd predicted, had not paid the rent. And that is the part of Charles Kelly's story that matters most, in a way, because it is the part that is true for so many more men than just him. For every hero the country celebrated for a season, there were thousands who came home from that war carrying wounds no medal covered, to lives that were harder than the parades ever suggested. Men who, in the language of that time, were called shell-shocked or suffering battle fatigue, and whom we would now recognize as living with the deep, lasting injuries of combat. Charles Kelly is remembered today, on a memorial marker that bears his name, not only for the storehouse at Altavilla, but as a stand-in for all those soldiers, the ones who did impossible things and then came home to find that the hardest battle was the one that came after. Corporal Charles E. Commando Kelly of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, of the 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, the private who couldn't handle parade drill, who washed out of paratrooper school, who landed at Salerno in his first days of combat, and then, across a single day and night at Altavilla, wiped out machine gun nests, crossed a killing ground alone to scout an enemy hill, ran an ammunition line under fire, and finally held a storehouse by himself with a Browning rifle, a bazooka, and mortar shells thrown by hand, became the first enlisted man to earn the Medal of Honor in the European War. He died in 1985, somewhere. The descendants of the men he covered at Altavilla are alive today because one private stayed in that window until they were gone. The Germans came to take back one small Italian town, and they ran into one American in one window, who fought them with everything an ammunition storehouse held, and when the guns were empty, fought them with the ammunition itself, thrown by hand. Charles Kelly said his medals would just be a lot of brass. He was wrong about the only thing that matters. A piece of brass is nothing but the reason it was given. A man who would not leave a window until his friends were safe is everything, and it does not tarnish, and it does not get forgotten by the people who care enough to remember. Commando Kelly came home to a hard, quiet life, and most of the country forgot him, which is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, anyone in your family fought in Italy, or landed at Salerno, or served with the 36th Division, or came home from any war carrying more than they ever talked about, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The heroes the country forgot deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.